Hey guys, how you doing? Luna here with a new video for the channel. I hope you're doing well and welcome back to a new episode of the Versus series where I take your favorite artists, albums and songs and face them off against each other. Today we have a really special episode because we're talking about one of the oldest and most legendary beefs in music history, which is George Harrison against the Beatles, or more specifically Lennon and McCartney. The thing is that it's a common narrative that's been dragged around, including George himself. He has participated in building up this narrative that both Lennon and McCartney, especially Paul, overlooked him as an artist and just didn't want him to grow. They did want him to be a great guitarist because that was, his main role in the Beatles, but, they didn't want him to be as good as a songwriter as both of them were, and that pissed them off a lot, which led to him basically just running off of the band by 1968. But to find out if this is true, we have to go back to the early years of the band with the first releases, Please Please Me with the Beatles, Beatles for Sale, and A Hard Day's Night, where George participated a lot in terms of, musician as a guitarist and as one of the co-songwriters of some of the tracks, adding up a few ideas. But in terms of him as a songwriter alone, he didn't actually participate that much. Actually, most of the songs he actually sang in those albums were covers, and covers arranged by Paul and John, not really arranged by him. By 1965, with the release of Help, we had I Need You, which is one of the first, if not the first actually, the first track that George actually wrote and was released for the band, and I fucking love that track. I think it's a really beautiful ballad. I love this sort of looped guitar chords in that track. I love the lyrics. I think they're really wholesome, and I love the hook. I love George's performance. I think he, it was obviously shown that he was a great singer as well. And with the release of Rubber Soul, it was even more obvious with tracks like Things for Yourself and If I Needed Someone that, If I Needed Someone is one of my favorite Beatles tracks ever. The contribution from Paul in the vocals is great. I love that track. But really, the point where George really started to compare himself with the rest of the band in terms of songwriting was in Revolver in 1966, when he opened up the album with Taxman, which is one of the most streamed songs from the album. It was the first time that the Beatles centered, the themes in his songs about politics or something more important than love or money or things like that, because the lyrical themes from the Beatles in albums prior to those were really personal and really based on emotions. Instead, this one was based on politics, and I think it sounds really good. He also has Love You Too, which again, by the time that song was released, it was one of the most innovative things the Beatles had done up to date. But here's the thing, that track for me is the weakest on the album, but props to George for trying, changing the things up a little bit. By 1967, we have multiple singles by George Harrison. We have singles from Sgt Pepper's like With and Without You, a track that, I think it uses the sitar and the Indu influences way better than Love You Too. You also have songs outside of Sgt. Pepper's, for example, Blue Way J, which is one of the, from the psychedelic era of the Beatles, is one of my favorite tracks. You also have Only a Northern Song, and you have All Too Much, again, really good tracks. But it was in 1968 where George actually started to make himself up the idea of wanting to be a solo artist, and he actually released an EP called Wonderwall Music, which is horrible, but it showcased, George's direction in terms of songwriting and what he wanted to do. And with the release of the White Album, because it was such a fucking long album, 30 tracks, George had more space to put out his material, and that's when we get to see the best of him with tracks like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, an amazing song, one of the best songs from that album. You have Piggies, you have Long, Long, Long. The tensions in the band from 1968 onwards started to grow so much that George, held a lot of material, from the White Album for his own solo projects in the future, because in many other tracks from his first album, All Things Must Pass, come from the Get Back sessions and the White Album sessions in 1968. Because believe it or not, the reason why All Things Must Pass is such a huge album is because it was a lot of material that George couldn't, didn't want to release with the Beatles. In Abbey Road, released in 1969, George proved even further that he was actually a great songwriter, and some people say that in that album he was on pair with John and Paul, with the release of songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, some of the best tracks from that album, and actually I would dare to say that he actually surpassed Paul and John in that record, definitely. And then in 1970, you have For Your Blue and I Me Mine. Now, you can see that George actually released quite a lot of material for the Beatles while he was in the band. So, was he really overlooked? George always talks about all the songs that he couldn't release being with the Beatles. And, considering that supposedly all of those songs are in All Things Must Pass, we have to wonder if the tracks were really that great as he said they were. Before we go even further, again, I want to state that I have nothing but respect and praise for George Harrison's career. Is it his solo career or what he did with the Beatles or even his fucking movies? I respect every single thing he did, and I just have nothing but love for him as a person as well. His work with the Beatles and a lot of his solo material have influenced me a lot, and I love the guy. I just love him. So getting back on track, George himself said that for him, it was mainly Paul the one who overlooked him. And, the reason was because George wanted to do things a certain way. And Paul, who was pretty much the mastermind in terms of marketing for the Beatles, often said no to this, no to that, especially when it was Paul's music. Paul apparently was really open for John to criticize his music and for John's contributions to his own songwriting. Actually, Paul is nothing but proud to say that this or that was John's idea, not his. For example, in the opening of Obla Di Obla Da, they said that they were going around with that song and they didn't know how to open up the song, and then John came in, did the thing with the piano, and that's how the song started, and it was great. So people argue that Paul had way more respect for John as a songwriter than George, and this is true and not true at the same time. First of all, I do agree that it was obvious that Paul had way more chemistry in terms of songwriting with John. George, once again, at the beginning of his career, didn't actually want to be a songwriter. He himself has said that. At the very beginning, he just wanted to be a guitarist and yes, perform on a couple of tracks, and that's it. So it's more than obvious that Paul had a better relationship in terms of songwriting with John than with George. Paul has, praised multiple times George's contributions to songwriting for the Beatles. For example, in the track I Love Her, one of the biggest hits from the Beatles, Paul said that if it weren't for George, that track wouldn't be half as popular as it is, because he came up with the intro and the little guitar riffs on the song, and that's, what makes the song so elegant and so beautiful, along with the melody, of course. Regarding John, a lot of times George has said that John overlooked him as a songwriter, but John himself actually praised something as the best track from Abbey Road and suggested that for the next Beatles album, George should participate way more in the songwriting, which again, it's quite sad that we never received another Beatles album, because Abbey Road was the last one to be recorded or to be written. But again, when you look back at all the nice things that John said about George and the fact that he called him when he was about to do his debut album and Imagine and many other albums that John did, that shows nothing but respect on John's end. And this argument of George Harrison releasing the best tracks of Abbey Road, it is true. Something and Here Comes the Sun are probably the best tracks out of that album. But, we shouldn't ignore the fact that in that record, we also have Come Together and I Want You So Heavy by John Lennon, and we have Oh Darling and the Abbey Road Medley by Paul McCartney. Those two are also amazing pieces of music, almost on par with the tracks that George did. By the way, remember that the blooming of George Harrison as a songwriter came in by the 1968. It wasn't like in Revolver he had like a shitload of tracks that were as great as I'm Only Sleeping, Good Day Sunshine, Eleanor Rigby, Tomorrow Never Knows, but he couldn't release them because, John and Paul were like, no. If you release those tracks, then you'll be better than us, and we just can't allow that, as if we're not trying to sell the fucking album. When actually, when you compare John's solo discography and Paul's solo discography to George, you can see a big difference in terms of quality. I mean, George has some amazing albums. Again, like I love that guy's discography quite a lot, but I cannot, I can't compare it to John or to Paul. You just can't. People grab All Things Must Pass, which is an amazing album, one of the best albums of all time, period, as evidence that George was actually the most talented Beatle, because people believe that, if you take all the debuts or all the, the early Beatle breakup albums that every artist released, George has the best one. But, I can agree that you have the better set of tracks And that's about it, because you have such a huge amount of songs, you obviously have more good material. But would you really say that this album is as relevant, as significant, and as important as a record like Plastic Ono Band, which was one of the first times that an artist felt so vulnerable and so honest with his feelings, not only in the lyrics but in the performances, by screaming the hell out, by not worrying so much about the melodies and how perfect they were? Or Ram in 1971 by Paul McCartney and Linda, where Paul basically, kick-started indie music. I personally don't think so. So even with that argument, I don't agree with. For me, the Beatles were perfect as they were. I do think that, it was a dysfunctional group. It was a group that in terms of personal things and emotions, they didn't get along very well. But when it came to music, I think they had great chemistry, even though they like to deny it. And even though, they can say 1,000 times that the White Album sessions were horrible, or, the Get Back sessions were horrible, I think that they had just a way of understanding each other that it's unmatched, and they created the best discography in the history of music. And if you want proof of that, you just have to listen to the albums. I think that they were just great musicians that got along very well when it came to music. And I believe that this argument about George being overlooked is something that he himself dropped with the years. By the end of it, when they made the anthology, there was no beef there anymore. There was no comments of George being overlooked or anything like that. They went on, they both matured, and I think that we as fans should do the same thing and admit John, Paul, George, and Ringo crafted the best discography in the history of music. All four of them. If you remove one, you're done. You don't have as good as a discography, okay? So rest in peace, George Harrison, man. I really do enjoy his music. I love every single time that I put All Things Must Pass, or Living in the Material World, or Brainwash, his posthumous album. I just love it, man. I love the guy. And with that being said, guys, I really hope that you do enjoy this video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. Let me know your opinion. Do you think that George Harrison was overlooked in the Beatles or not? Me personally, I'm gonna say it again, I think that he did have, he did have some pretty good ideas when he was in the band, but I don't think that, his ideas were as good as John and Paul's. And when they were as good and even better than John and Paul's, you'd find those songs in the album. I just don't buy into this. I had so many better songs in the shelf and I couldn't release them. But again, just let me know what you think. Was he overlooked or not? Leave it down below and I'll make sure to check it out. With that being said, once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you guys soon with a new video. But until then, bye.